Unit 731. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army built a secret facility in Manchuria called Unit 731. On paper, it was described as a research center. In reality, it was closer to a horror camp than a laboratory. Here, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Soviet POWs, and even women and children, became unwilling test subjects. They weren't treated as humans. The doctors who worked there referred to them as logs, as if they were nothing more than objects to be cut open. The experiments were brutal. People were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and other diseases just to see how fast they would kill. Entire villages in China were attacked with plague bombs to test how outbreaks spread. Victims were also placed into freezing chambers until their limbs turned solid with frostbite, then thawed with hot water or fire, just so scientists could measure the damage. Some of the worst accounts describe prisoners being dissected alive, with no anesthesia. The surgeons wanted to study the effects of disease on living organs, and they couldn't risk the body shutting down under drugs. What's even darker is what happened after the war. When Japan surrendered, many expected the people behind Unit 731 to face trials, like the Nazis at Nuremberg. But instead, the U.S. military granted immunity to Unit 731's leaders in exchange for their research on biological warfare. The scientists who should have been punished were instead protected, and in some cases rewarded with careers in medicine and academia. Victims' families never received justice. To this day, much of Unit 731's work remains hidden in classified files. MKUltra. In the early 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, the CIA launched a secret project known as MKUltra. The goal was to find ways to control the human mind, to create truth serums, break down prisoners, and even reprogram people for use as spies. What makes MKUltra so disturbing is how the experiments were carried out. Many subjects had no idea they were being tested. Soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even ordinary citizens were dosed with LSD without consent. Some were kept in isolation for weeks, bombarded with drugs, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture. The experiments often pushed people past the breaking point. Victims reported terrifying hallucinations, memory loss, and in some cases, complete mental collapse. One scientist, Frank Olson, allegedly jumped to his death after being secretly drugged, though many believe he was silenced to cover up what had happened. For decades, MKUltra was hidden from the public. It wasn't until the 1970s, after congressional investigations, that the truth came out. But by then, most of the files had already been destroyed on CIA orders. Only fragments remained, leaving historians to piece together the scale of the program. To this day, no one knows how many lives were destroyed in the name of national security. Operation Midnight Climax. In the 1950s, as part of Project MKUltra, the CIA launched one of its strangest operations, codenamed Operation Midnight Climax. The agency set up hidden safe houses in San Francisco and New York, disguised as brothels. Sex workers were hired by the CIA to lure unsuspecting men inside. What those men didn't know was that their drinks were secretly laced with LSD. Behind one-way mirrors, CIA operatives sat and watched as the drugs took hold. They weren't just studying the effects of LSD, they wanted to see how people acted under the influence of both drugs and sex, and whether it could be used for blackmail or mind control. These experiments were never consensual. The victims had no idea they were being drugged or monitored. To the CIA, they were just data points in a larger game of psychological warfare. Operation Midnight Climax ran for nearly a decade before it was quietly shut down in the 1960s. But the damage was already done. The men who were drugged never knew the truth, and the files that might have revealed more were destroyed. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service carried out what is now remembered as one of the darkest medical studies in American history. Around 600 African American men in Alabama were recruited, most of them poor sharecroppers. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague local term that could mean anything from fatigue to anemia. In truth, the men were never treated. Even after penicillin was proven to cure syphilis in the 1940s, doctors withheld the drug. Instead, they allowed the disease to progress so they could observe its long-term effects. The men suffered blindness, mental illness, organ failure, and many died. Their families were left devastated, with wives infected and children born with congenital syphilis. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower exposed it to the press. By then, it had run for 40 years. No apologies or compensation came until decades later, when President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the nation in 1997. Bikini Atoll nuclear tests. In 1946, fresh out of World War II, the U.S. military launched a series of nuclear tests called Operation Crossroads. The site chosen was Bikini Atoll, a small chain of islands in the Pacific. The government told the local islanders they'd be temporarily relocated for the good of science. In reality, they would never be able to return to their homeland. To measure the effects of nuclear blasts, the military assembled a ghost fleet of nearly 100 warships, filling them with pigs, goats, and rats. Thousands of American soldiers were stationed nearby to observe. Some were ordered to stand on the decks of ships just miles from ground zero, facing the blinding flash of the mushroom cloud. The military insisted it was safe, but the truth was very different. Radiation spread across the lagoon, contaminating the water and the land. Soldiers who participated reported burns, hair loss, cancers, and other illnesses in the years that followed. Many had their claims dismissed as coincidence. Even worse, the people of Bikini Atoll were never able to return home. Their island remained radioactive for decades, forcing generations to live in exile. The mustard gas experiments. During World War II, the U.S. military secretly conducted mustard gas experiments on its own soldiers. Men were placed in sealed chambers or marched into contaminated fields, where they were forced to breathe and absorb the gas until painful blisters covered their skin. Many suffered severe burns, lung damage, and lasting health problems. What makes this even more disturbing is who was chosen. A large number of test subjects were minority soldiers, including Black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American troops. The government wanted to see if different races reacted differently to chemical exposure, turning racism into science under the guise of research. For decades, these veterans were silenced. Many were denied medical treatment and disability benefits because the tests were classified. It wasn't until the 1990s that the truth began to surface, when survivors finally came forward with their stories. The mustard gas experiments remain one of the darkest examples of how patriotism was exploited and how discrimination shaped decisions that left soldiers scarred for life, both physically and emotionally. Project Sunshine. Project Sunshine is one of the most unsettling examples of how far governments were willing to go in the name of science. Beginning in the early 1950s, researchers quietly launched a study to measure how radioactive fallout from nuclear tests spread through the human body. To do this, they needed tissue samples, especially from the young, whose growing bones absorbed more strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear explosions. Without informing families, scientists collected bones and organs from thousands of deceased infants and children across the US, Europe, and even Australia. Parents who thought their children were buried whole never knew that parts had been taken for government research. In some cases, tiny ribs or pieces of skull were removed during autopsies and shipped to laboratories, all under strict secrecy. The program wasn't publicly revealed until the mid-1990s, sparking outrage from families who had unknowingly been part of it. For many, the betrayal was worse than the science itself, the idea that their grief had been compounded by government deception. Ironically, the research did help confirm just how widespread nuclear contamination had become, influencing future test bans. But that scientific value can't erase the ethical violations. Project Sunshine remains a haunting reminder that even well-intentioned research can cross moral boundaries when transparency and consent are abandoned. Project 112 and SHAD. Although the mosquitoes weren't infected with disease during the trials, the message was clear. The Army wanted to know if insect-based biological warfare could cripple enemy populations. To officials, Big Buzz was a success. To the public, once the story surfaced years later, it revealed just how casually the government had gambled with civilian safety, turning ordinary towns into test sites without consent. From the early 1960s through the 1970s, the U.S. military carried out a massive program known as Project 112. A major part of it was called SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. The goal was to see how vulnerable American ships and troops were to chemical and biological attacks. Thousands of sailors were unknowingly used as test subjects. Navy ships were sprayed with substances like VX nerve agent, sarin, and biological tracers such as Bacillus globigii, chosen because it mimicked anthrax. Soldiers were told these were safety tests, but in reality, many were directly exposed to toxic materials. For decades, the Pentagon flatly denied the program existed. Veterans who became sick with cancers, lung diseases, and other mysterious illnesses were told it was just bad luck. It wasn't until the 1990s, after documents were declassified, that the truth surfaced. By then, many victims had already passed away, never knowing what had really been done to them. If you think this was disturbing, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe and see for yourself.